Why Carolina? We always appreciate you stopping by for the best in discussion, debate, and analysis right here at the Voice of College Football. Please like the video and subscribe. Hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live. Check out the Clemson and Florida State channels for the latest updates on those specific court cases against the ACC. Let's talk North Carolina here. Why? Well, there were statements made this week. In Monday's interview with WRAL Sports Fan Radio, University of North Carolina Board of Trustee member and former chairman David Bolake made these comments, quote, Carolina's ability to maintain excellence at a high level is going to require really prudent budgeting and revenue models and potential cost cutting. A lot of it's due to the revenue or lack thereof of revenue that we're not receiving from the ACC deal. Bolake also said it's not something you can chance with the snap of a finger. It's something you've got to be cognizant of. We can't sit back and cross our fingers and pray for pennies from heaven and thinking everything is going to work out. We have to actively pursue what's the best interest of Carolina athletics. He also said it's time for the Tar Heels to get serious about leaving the ACC for higher performing conference with greater revenue sharing. I am advocating for that. That's what we need to do. We need to do everything we can to get there. Or the alternative is the ACC is going to have to reconstruct itself. I think all the options are on the table. And while Florida State and now Clemson are at the forefront of fighting the ACC, actually taking that next tangible step of fighting the conference in court on two fronts each. So the ACC, of course, countersued in the state of North Carolina against both Florida State and Clemson. Now, North Carolina has become the most vocal outside of those two. You would think, at least from a football standpoint, that Miami would be the most viable option and the most lucrative option for the Big Ten, the SEC, and there's talk about Miami possibly being lured by the Big 12. But here are some reasons why North Carolina is extremely attractive for both the Big Ten and the SEC. North Carolina is a great school. That's first and foremost. That may not be the most important to fan bases, or it may not be the most important in this equation, but it is still substantial. And we know that the Big Ten values great schooling, academic brand. And North Carolina is not just in the top 25, according to U.S. News and World Report. It's increasing in value. It's getting better as a school, higher ranked as a school. It has jumped from number 28 just a few years ago to number 22 in the public university rankings. And as we understand it, North Carolina does play men's basketball and plays it pretty darn well. And although the game is not as popular as it once was, when North Carolina steps on the floor, especially against Duke, they draw massive television ratings. So the North Carolina basketball brand is one of the very few in college basketball that moves the needle and actually is part of the conversation along with the football discussion. And consider that the Big Ten has been down in basketball in recent years, and although strong in basketball during much of the 21st century, the conference has not won a national championship since Michigan State in the year 2000. Now let's say North Carolina is plucked up by the Big Ten. Is there a partner from the ACC? And if we're strictly talking basketball, of course, Duke, North Carolina, that is arguably the greatest rivalry in college athletics. When they step on the court, people watch the game. It was the most watched college basketball game on the men's side this past season, even though it was not a Final Four or a championship game. And the same held true when they played in the Final Four. It outdrew the national championship game by a considerable margin. So does North Carolina bring Duke? Duke brings, of course, the great basketball brand and tradition. The academics are sterling. The football, don't be fooled by recent success under Mike Elko and even David Cutcliffe. The football is pretty atrocious, does not have a following, doesn't bring any viewers to the TV screen. So that would be the con in terms of Duke, and of course it's an extremely small school. Does North Carolina tag team along with NC State, a la what we saw on the West Coast coming to the Big Ten in USC and UCLA, where USC was the brand and UCLA still a strong brand, but with some weakness there and couldn't necessarily carry its own weight, but tagged along with USC, similar to North Carolina and NC State. And UCLA fans, I'm not making a comparison between you and NC State other than that is the comparison within the rivalry. North Carolina carries it, USC carries it from a football standpoint and a current brand standpoint. There's no question about that. So is it NC State as a lean or Duke as a lean going to the Big Ten in particular? Let's also keep in mind that it's not as crucial in basketball to keep these rivalries intact as it is in football because of the flexibility of the non-conference schedule. You play about 16 or 18 conference games in basketball. You fill it out for another 10 or 12 games out of conference. You can easily maintain a rivalry outside the conference. So North Carolina could head to the Big Ten, for example. Duke could stay in a reworked ACC, and they can maintain their basketball rivalry a la Louisville and Kentucky for years and years and years as different conference foes in basketball. And the examples run wild all over the place, Notre Dame, UCLA, and others that maintained college basketball rivalries while not playing in the same conference. Miami's a better football brand than North Carolina. And of course, Miami's been down for close to 20 years now, playing roughly 7-5 football for an entire 2 decades. And that's pretty much what North Carolina has been. But despite Miami being down, they've still played better football and have been more competitive by and large than North Carolina over the last 2 decades. So why has North Carolina seemingly surpassed Miami in regards to the allure from the Big Ten and the SEC? Well, we just pointed out a few things in regards to academics and also the basketball brand, but also it's a growing population there in North Carolina and has been for quite some time. And also, let's keep this in mind. The SEC has not stepped foot in the state of North Carolina. And the Big Ten does not have a foothold, no schools in the state of North Carolina. The SEC is awfully close in South Carolina, and now the Big Ten is awfully close in Maryland. And the SEC, of course, wants the South, and of course, the Big Ten has traveled all over the place to grab up turf nationally, and North Carolina is a growing, burgeoning state, a very attractive state from a number of standpoints, especially with television markets that now rank 21st, 22nd, 36th, and 45th in Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Greenville, and Greensboro. So there is not a metropolis in North Carolina, but the entire state is just growing. And there's a ton of money there and a ton of expansion and a ton of corporations that have found North Carolina to be a home. So Miami, North Carolina, I believe North Carolina is probably slightly a better brand overall. Of course, the football still has to go the Miami way with the recruiting in mind as well with the Canes. Your thoughts about North Carolina? The brand, the basketball, the TV ratings, the media attention that the brand draws, and of course the academics, a big draw for the Big Ten in particular. Leave your comments down below as we try to size it up here at the Voice of College Football. And we leave you with a couple clips that we posted in March of 2024 and then all the way going back to July of 2022, where we sized up North Carolina as a brand for the Big Ten. Enjoy. Winning just 58% of their games over the past 15 to 20 years, Miami is 102-74. Sounds like a decent record for other schools, but not championship contending teams for the last 20 years. If somebody would have said when Miami joined the ACC from the Big East in 2004 that the Hurricanes 20 years later would not have a ACC championship, had only appeared in one ACC championship game, that would have been unthinkable. There is the potential. There is the possibility. They're coming off 5-7 and 7-6 under Mario Cristobal. And the recruiting, though, has been exceptional under Cristobal. Number 4 in the nation this past recruiting cycle. Is Miami ready for another surge? The marginal status of Miami football has certainly hurt its national television numbers despite it maintaining a brand status. They get relegated to the ACC network far too often. They drew over 13.5 million views in 2021 in network television games, 7.3 million in 2022, and 16 million this past season. That totals 36.8 million over those 3 seasons. Miami draws from one of the biggest groups of television markets in all the United States. Miami itself is number 18. However, Tampa's close, Orlando's close, West Palm Beach, basically South Florida is a huge population base. All of those markets are in the top 40 in the country. And of course, Miami's a national brand and it has folks that have jumped on the bandwagon going back to the 1980s all over the country. In 2021, the academic rank was tied with Florida State at number 55 in the country, despite gaining AAU status. Miami's dropped from 55 to 67. I don't know what that's attributed to. The enrollment has gone up 1,200 students to 12,500 currently, and the endowment is strong at $1.4 billion. Rarely in talking about realignment do we bring basketball into the conversation. Of course, men's college basketball is huge. It's popular, but it's been more popular in the past. It's declining. So there's only a handful of schools where it really moves the needle. Well, of course, Carolina Blue is one of those. But looking at football, football's been up and down. Mack Brown is in his second stint at North Carolina. Of course, the first time he came around, he took a moribund, awful football program and lifted it to national top 10 status. He's attempting to do the same this time around. Larry Fedora had only won 5 games in 2 years prior to Mack Brown. And then Brown lifts them to an Orange Bowl in 2020, their first major bowl appearance in decades and decades and decades. But only 9-5 and 8-5 the past 2 seasons. They've kind of settled into a fringe top 25 team. 98 and 81 since 2010. It has definitely been an up and down program, but draws decent viewers on network television. About 10 to 11 to 12 million per season on ABC and ESPN. 32.7 million over those 3 seasons. And the television markets are strong in North Carolina. This is one of the most robust, growing areas in terms of population. It has been for decades, with Charlotte now a top 21 market. Greenville's up there. Raleigh-Durham's in the top 25. And Greensboro makes for another top 50 market that you would think that there would be interest for North Carolina football. Academically, North Carolina, extremely strong, has been linked many times in conversations to the Big Ten, and actually has moved the needle just in the last few years, going from number 28 to number 22 in academic ranking since 2021. The enrollment has stayed around 20,000, and the endowment is substantial. We saw the numbers from Clemson and Florida State and Miami in the $1+ billion range. Multiply that 5 times. North Carolina's endowment is up to number 9 in the country at $5.2 billion. Now let's break down these schools and these football programs in terms of how they stack up in a rankings order against each other in each one of these categories. Let's look at the football first and foremost and how it stands right this second. We could have an argument between Clemson and Florida State. Florida State just finished 13-1. They won the ACC. Mike Norvell's doing an outstanding job. They are tearing it up in the transfer portal. The recruiting has been good, not exceptional, not necessarily quite at the rate that Clemson continues to recruit under Dabo Swinney, who did win an ACC championship in 2022. I know that the narrative is that Clemson has fallen off, and that is obvious, but we're talking about a fall off from being one of the top 2 programs in college football post-2015. Clemson's still strong. We'll see if Dabo can adjust to the transfer portal and make some moves there. I would still rate Clemson with a slight edge over Florida State because Norvell and this program has not proven it over a long period of time, but 10-3 and 13-1 is impressive. Miami, despite not playing well on the field, of course, Manny Diaz was struggling through a 21-16 run. And Mario Cristobal's only 12-13 in his 2 years at Miami. The recruiting has been outstanding under Cristobal. Top 7 and then top 4 in the nation in his 2 recruiting cycles. And Diaz was recruiting in the top 10 to 15 in the nation. So they've got the roster and they're in a good position. So I'm going to continue to rank Miami, despite the lack of wins on the field, over North Carolina. Now, the Heels, I would rank them higher, but the last 2 seasons have not been exceptional. Mac Brown took over and instantly made North Carolina a better football team, but it's plateaued, seriously plateaued, to 8-5, 9-5 the last 2 years. Virginia Tech, again, the Brent Pry bounced back this past season to a nice bowl win at 7-6, but let's see if that lasts and if he's able to continue the momentum. Difficult place to recruit to. Georgia Tech, Brent Key doing a nice job, but consider if Miami takes a knee against Georgia Tech does not get the opportunity to go to a bowl game to finish 7-6. They're a 5-7 football team. And then, of course, Virginia is a clear number 7, coming off 2 3-win seasons under Tony Elliott. However, they played extremely tough. Outside of a couple blowouts, they played extremely well and down to the wire against a lot of decent teams last year. Keep an eye on the Cavaliers. Historically, it's another close call between Florida State, Miami, and Clemson. If you go all-time to the beginning of time, Clemson's probably the best. They've got the most wins, the best winning percentage, all of that. However, since 1980, of course, Florida State and Miami have been far superior. In spots, Florida State's been more consistent. When Miami's at its best, they can peak higher than anyone in this group, you would think, based on what they've shown us in the 80s and 90s. Again, historically, I give the nod to Florida State as being consistently elite for decades, and then being able to follow that up with a national championship under Jimbo Fisher and a top 5 finish now under Mike Norvell. So they've done it at times under 3 coaches, with, of course, Bobby Bowden laying the groundwork. Virginia Tech, Frank Beamer, that's their history right there. That's all their success, but they've shown that they can do it with the right guy in charge. Georgia Tech, North Carolina, along with Virginia Tech, I kind of put them in a same grouping. You can make all sorts of arguments. Georgia Tech, I group together with Virginia Tech and North Carolina. You can make an argument for any one of those 3 in any order. Georgia Tech, historically, if you go all the way back to the beginning of college football, has had a great success going back to the early portion of the 20th century. Over the past several decades, 7-8 win program. Most of the time, they certainly have bottomed out with a lot of 3-win seasons and need to have the right coach. They need to try to take some advantage of playing in Atlanta. North Carolina football, of course, plays in the shadow of its basketball program, but it's been a decent football program that's gone to bowl games most of the time, won 7 and 8 games most of the time, but does not hit that upper level. They've gone to a couple ACC championship games in the past decade and lost both of those games to Clemson. Then Virginia, again, it's not even close. It's historically a bad football program. At its very best, it's been an 8-4 team at spots during the 80s and 90s, and then most recently for 1 season under Bronco Mendenhall. Let's talk about realistic potential. Miami's is through the roof. They could stay home and take about half, not even half, of the 4 and 5 stars within 50 miles and post a top 5 to 10 class in the nation in recruiting. They have a great academic school. They have so much going for them in so many ways that they should be better. They have made bad football hires. All you have to do is look at all their hires post Butch Davis, outside of Mark Richt, who had health issues, obviously, after he left Miami, and none of those guys succeeded anywhere else, before or after Miami. So what does that tell you? They've made bad football hires. Okay, Florida State has great potential. Of course, that's been obvious. They've fulfilled it many times. Clemson is maxed out under Dabo Swinney, and there's nothing wrong with maxing out, winning national championships, and going to the playoffs every year. But we have seen the best of Clemson football, so if they can get back to close to that status, that would be pretty substantial. Georgia Tech's got the potential of being not only in Atlanta, but Georgia has exploded in regards to football talent, both the quality and quantity, and even surpassed California. North Carolina, Virginia Tech, and Virginia is how I see the potential of these schools as football programs moving forward. We talked about the Miami media market not just being Miami itself, but the conglomeration of a number of large markets in South Florida and people moving to Florida. The state's growing. It's been growing for decades and continues to do so. Also, there's a glam factor with South Beach, Miami, celebrities. So Miami wins this battle over Georgia Tech simply because it's in Atlanta and there are NFL players standing on every street corner. North Carolina is at number 3. Florida State's at number 4. You've got Clemson, Virginia, and Virginia Tech. I'm pretty solid on that. Virginia just being much closer to Washington, D.C., and having the influence of a larger TV market if they could ever start winning some games. The Miami recruiting potential is otherworldly. They're tapping into it right now with Mario Cristobal with a couple top 10 classes. Georgia Tech sitting in Atlanta. We've addressed that. Florida State next, followed by North Carolina. The state of North Carolina in regards to football talent, underrated. Clearly a top 7 or 8 state in the country. Clemson draws from Georgia, South Carolina, and of course, they can recruit nationally, but I'm basing these rankings just on the footprint. And of course, Clemson's got some issues. The state of South Carolina, in terms of high school football, is not the best. Virginia's strong in terms of recruiting footprint, and so is Virginia Tech in that same state. Really, none of these football programs have an issue with recruiting. Drawing players from their location, that's not the problem. There are plenty of football players in the South and in these specific locations. In terms of academics, I don't consider North Carolina to be the breakaway winner here at number 1, but I do give them the nod based on the academic rankings we reviewed. Put North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia Tech in one grouping, and then the other 4 in another grouping, with Clemson the clear number 7 here. Florida State and Miami extremely close, as mentioned, tied in the U.S. News and World Report rankings as of 2021, and Virginia Tech is surprising number 47 in the country. Hey, Mark, what about the other ACC programs? Boston College, Pitt, they play in major markets. Syracuse has a great football tradition going back to the 1950s. Jim Brown, Ernie Davis. Also, North Carolina State playing really good football the past 3 or 4 years, in particular under Dave Doran. Yes, those schools, those football programs have some value. We wanted to differentiate, though, these 7 as being major players, major commodities for the Big Ten and the SEC to review. Please like the video, share these videos out on social media, spread the word about the voice of college football. Make it on back here as we continue to track this and everything else as we get to spring football here very soon. Check out all that we've got available right here at the Voice of College Football.